You are listening to the Bail Post. Welcome to our next episode of our podcast. Today we're going to be talking about 5 years looking back of bail reform in the state of New York. And our guest today is someone who's been on our podcast before. His name's Jim Quinn. People who've watched our last episode or the episode that he was on with us before, they know that he's a fourth generation New Yorker. He grew up in Ravenwood public housing projects in Long Island in Queens. He started working at the Queens District Attorney's Office in 1977. And so he's someone that we think is very knowledgeable on the issues of bail reform and crime in New York City. Thank you very much, Mr. Quinn, for coming back and talking to us about these issues.
I'm very happy to be here.
Talk to me. So if you were just to say, okay, looking back at New York 5 years after bail reform, what would you tell a person? Is it a success? Is it a failure? How would you describe it?
It's been a failure. Again, it depends on what your metric for success is. A lot of the bail reform people judge success in the number of people who are held in pretrial custody. And as long as they get that number down, then it's a success. And they don't really look at the ancillary effects of bail reform and what that's caused. If you look at it on its effect on crime and even on alternative sentencing programs and rehabilitation and recidivism, well, then it's been an abject failure. And it's always been a mystery to me how they can't accept that fact. They won't admit that fact.
Well, I find it very interesting because I think that's when you look at all the research that I've done in the last couple of days getting ready for this. I mean, you look at it and the measure for success is we have decreased the number of people who are being held in jail pretrial. And in what world is the measure of success reducing the number of people that we hold, irrespective of what impact that's having on crime?
Well, that's the bail reform world. I mean, it really is. And, it's kind of like an Alice in Wonderland way of looking at things. You can't, I started an article one time, or ended an article one time, just writing that there is more crime on the streets of New York City because there are more criminals on the streets of New York City. And there are more criminals on the streets of New York City because of bail reform. And, that really that sums up everything. And, you can almost end any discussion of bail reform just with those two lines.
So let's set the stage. When we talk about bail reform in New York, it started in 2019 or passed, went into effect in 2020, and then immediately, ever since it's passed, it's now had 3 rollbacks where, I would say classify the rollbacks as they've increased the number of crimes that they could set bail for. But if we start out with, this is a charge-based release system where they make a long list of charges where the judge no longer has the discretion to set bail. They must release them without bail. And then the rollbacks were really to bring stuff back to the list or take things off of the no bail list and put them back on the judge has the discretion to set bail. Mostly focused on violent offenses, probably exclusively on felony offenses. The last rollback in 2023, among it was they repealed the requirement that the judge use the least restrictive conditions language. How would you summarize all these rollbacks? Because it seems like they still cannot set bail at all for any misdemeanor.
Yeah, it's really, the rollbacks were, I think that they were more designed to assuage public opinion and make it look as if they were being tough. Some of them were legitimate, allowing judges to set bail on defendants who were on parole or probation or were on supervised release when they committed a crime is beneficial, but it only applied to defendants who committed a felony crime when they were on probation or parole. It didn't apply to shoplifters or people stealing car thieves or misdemeanor assaults or anything like that. So it sounded tough. You know how ridiculous this whole system was when the original bill bail bill that was passed didn't allow a judge to set bail on bail jumping or escape. That was how ridiculous New York City, the original bail reform law was. And that was one of the first things that they corrected in July of 2020. But a lot of the reforms are really designed to make it sound as if they're getting tough. And there's always a little wiggle room in there. I mean, a defendant who's out on
Hmm.
parole or probation can commit a whole bunch of misdemeanors,
Yeah.
and the judge can't set bail. And like you say, it's charge based rather than defendant based. And under the old law, it was defendant based. A judge could set bail on any crime, depending on the record of the defendant, the circumstances of the crime, the evidence against the defendant, the evidence of his guilt. All those things a judge could consider on any crime. So judges were able to set bail on, for instance, a defendant charged with petty larceny who had 40 prior arrests, and that's not unusual.
Hmm.
A judge could set bail on him, and the bail uh, very often it would keep a defendant in, and he would not be out there committing petty
Hmm.
larceny, doing the shoplifting.
I think that is such an important point. So when you have you have when you have bail set by the judge using their discretion, that's the whole purpose of it. They look at their criminal history, they look to see if they're going to continue to commit these crimes. But when you switch to a charge-based system, that ties the hands of the judges and career criminals, gangs, and organized crime. They learn how to manipulate that system to make millions and millions of dollars. And that's what we have is they know they can't be held. And so it's a green light to commit more crime.
It's absolutely a green light to commit crimes, and it also allows them out to commit crimes. You know, there were 50,000 reports of shoplifting in New York City
Hmm.
in any given year. There are the number of people who are in jail for any misdemeanor in New York City is maybe 200. And, you know, and that includes assaults and, misdemeanor assaults and petty larcenies and minor drug crimes, stuff like that. People who have been sentenced, prisoners, sentenced inmates. But when you have 50,000 reported retail thefts, um, it's not a lot of people committing those crimes. I mean, in New York
Yeah.
City, the police department issued a report that there were 347 defendants who accounted for 30% of all the retail theft arrests in the
Mhm.
city of New York. 347 people. It's in a normal world that's really looking at improving the quality of life or reducing crime or getting these people into programs. You would allow a judge to set bail on those people, or you would allow a judge to make a condition of their release that they go into treatment programs because a lot of them are drug addicts and
Yeah.
severely uh, uh, dysfunctional people. And in the past, judges used to be able to condition release on a defendant going into a program. And if he didn't go into the program, a judge could set bail on him.
Mhm.
Now, in New York City, in New
Yeah.
York State, a judge can set conditions on a defendant, say you have to go into mandatory drug treatment. And if the defendant doesn't go into mandatory drug treatment, if it's not a qualifying bail offense, a judge can't put bail on him.
Sure.
So why would you, these people don't want to go into these things voluntarily. They will only go into them if there's some hammer over them. And the hammer that judges used to use was the ability
Hmm.
to remand defendants or set bail on them if they refused or failed to comply with diversion treatment. And that's one of the big failures of bail reform that I think people are not really paying all that much attention to.
I think that's so important is we're highlighting that highlighting that for policymakers. In this bail reform movement, which if you want to give them a good intent, or if you say they had good intentions, this has had a really bad consequence because we're taking misdemeanors and we're making them the training ground for felonies. People that we could have turned around using, like you said, the hammer. If we gave the judge the tools that he needs so that he can have an influence on these defendants to turn them around, we have tied his hands and he no longer has that tool. And so we're making people worse off because they're not being turned around, and as a result, they're gradually committing more and more crimes, or just the sheer number, so that eventually, when they do have to face the music, they're facing a much longer song. They're going to be in jail for a much longer time than if we had just given the tools. And the point that you made about it's a same number of people committing a lot of these crimes. It's not going to affect jail crowding. It's not going to make it an overcrowded situation. And I think the data supports that.
Well, I mean, New York City had, I mean, we had the capacity for 20,000
Hmm.
inmates on between Rikers Island and the various. We had four smaller jails in each in the counties, so we had a capacity for 20,000 defendants. When bail reform was passed, we had 7,800 defendants incarcerated in New York City jail, and that's because crime went down. Crime went down 85% from 1993 to 2019.
Hmm.
85%. And the jail population went down 60% during that time also. So and New York City had one of the lowest incarceration rates of any city in the United States of America in 2019, before bail reform was passed. When bail reform was passed, 2,000 people were let out of jail almost overnight. And they were, these are people who were getting treatment in uh, in the city jail system, whether it was medical
True.
treatment, psychological treatment, or some kind of drug treatment. They were all released all at once, and there was no follow-up treatment for them because it all happened so quickly. Judges were releasing people a little bit earlier than the actual effective date because they didn't want 2,000 people walking out of Rikers in one day. So now you've got 2,000 people, dysfunctional people, because they were
Yeah.
for people to be held in jail on a misdemeanor or a nonviolent felony. You had to have a long record. You had to have been a problem person out on the street, unable to manage yourself. And when you released all those people out, crime went up almost immediately. And it's just to sit there and say that this program is a success. It just defies common sense.
Well, it seems like you're ignoring, we've already talked about it. You're ignoring what the law enforcement measurements for success are, and you're setting a new standard for what success, and that's just reducing the jail population. But, one of the things you mentioned the last time we spoke was that there was this push to lower the capacity for the prison system or the jail system in New York. They were going to close Rikers Islands and only have these regional uh, jails, and that would have a backdoor push for uh, criminal justice reform because they just wouldn't have the capacity. What's going on with that? Or can you update us on that since then?
you know, it's it would almost be comical if it weren't so ridiculous. Um, they've the city wanted to close Rikers Island, so they set up a commission of consisting of people who wanted to close Rikers Island.
Hmm.
And the mandate of the commission was not whether to close Rikers Island, but how to close Rikers Island.
Hmm.
So they come up with a plan, and they're going to build 5 jails all around the city of New York. They're going to reduce the jail population from, at that point, it was about 10,000. They were going to reduce it down to 6,000. And they were going to build 4 jails, one in each of the major counties in New York City. And each jail would house about 1,500 inmates. Now, that was the commission's recommendation. When it came out and the communities found out that these gigantic jails, some of them 30 or 40 stories high, were going to be built in their neighborhoods, the city reduced the capacity of those jails down to 3,300. And now, again, at the time, the population was about 9,000, 10,000. They were going to reduce it down to 3,300. And then they started to build those jails. Now, it was originally supposed to cost $8 billion. And it was supposed to be done by January of 2027. Now it's going to cost $15 billion. And they won't be ready until the earliest will be in 2029. At least 2 of them won't be ready until 2032. So, and they're now looking to increase the jail population to about 4,000 or 4,500. It's kind of fuzzy math exactly how many they're going to have. But still, it would require them to release another
Hmm.
2,500 people from New York City jails. And the 2,500 people who are in there now are people who are bail eligible under the bail reform, who have much worse records
Yeah.
than even the misdemeanor defendants who were in there before. They're violent criminals. They're criminals, people who have long histories. And those jails now, because everything was taking so much longer, they set up another commission chaired by the same person who chaired the first commission and comprised of a lot of the same people who were on the first commission. And they just came out with a report about a week and a half ago, um, saying that, well, now, we're going to, they come up with the number 4,500 that they're going to recommend that the number of people incarcerated be. And they think that the city can move this stuff up, by doing this and doing that. And it's all just so stupid. I mean, I don't know how to describe it in any other way. It is frustrating that they will not listen to logic. I mean, you can't have a jail system with a capacity of 4,500 people in a city of 8.5 million people and expect that to function in any kind of legitimate way.
You can't have that unless the whole purpose of having that is to force criminal justice bail reform because they no longer have the capacity to hold anyone but the worst of the worst. And so then you can't hold anyone that's a misdemeanor. They aren't even doing that anyway, but it makes it impossible. I mean, I would make the argument, why would you even have county courts, misdemeanor courts at all anymore? Just defund those, get rid of those. You'll save a lot more money than what you're claiming to do with getting rid of the jails. I mean, it would still have a huge impact on crime, but that's a better method of of doing that than what they're proposing.
Well, I honestly don't think we're far from that. I mean, you have a lot of the progressive DAs in New York City who are just simply not prosecuting certain crimes and
Yeah.
uh, reducing a lot of cases from felonies to misdemeanors. And you know, uh, we just to get back for a second on the treatment courts and the problem solving courts in New York City, the police really don't make prostitution arrests anymore.
Hmm.
Uh, and back in 2019, we had a human trafficking court,
Hmm.
which was designed to handle all the prostitution cases because it was you couldn't call it prostitution, you had to call it human trafficking of sex workers and that sort of thing. But we had a court that would handle all these cases. They're all misdemeanors, so they're all down in criminal court. And they would go into this court, and all the defendants would be uh, connected to social workers and services, treatment programs, and all sorts of things. And it was hailed as, "Oh, this is great. This is really great. We're dealing with the problem, not just the symptom. We're dealing with, trying to turn these people into get them out of that profession and get them into legitimate jobs." And that was great. We had 400 people, 400 defendants in the human trafficking court. Now we have about 20 because the police are no longer making those arrests. So those cases no longer go into human
Hmm.
trafficking court. And because of that, all these women who were, we were told that they were victims of predatory uh, organizations and gangs and all that sort of thing. Where are they?
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost 400 people who are getting treatment and services. They no longer are. And it's not like they people who have a drug addiction or a
Hmm.
psychological problem, it's not like they walk into a facility voluntarily to get treatment. That very rarely happens. And
I think that's the number one victim of all of this bad bail reform that we've seen in our urban areas. The death of these specialized courts because they have lost their hammer to get people to force them to give them an incentive to get treatment. I mean, because now you can't make them. You can't. The hammer's been taken away. The judges' hands are tied behind their back, and so they don't elect to go to the specialized courts anymore. And you're seeing the death of those across the country, and that it somehow has become a success. When the day before we were touting the success of these specialized courts.
the one of the again, it would be funny if it weren't so serious, but we used to have specialized courts for drug treatment. We had mental
Mhm.
health courts. We had alcohol abuse courts. We had youth misdemeanor courts. We had all sorts of specialized courts. They're all pretty much, they're still around, but they don't have the volume of people
Mhm.
that they had before because there is no longer the hammer forcing people in. But the Rikers Commission report, the revised one, recommended that we set up specialized courts to deal with these defendants so that judges have an option to put defendants in these specialized courts. But they're not going to change the bail laws.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and that's how we're going to reduce the population of Rikers. Instead of setting bail on somebody who is now currently bail eligible, we're going to take those individuals and put them in these specialized courts and let them, you
Well, let me
know,
ask you this though. So we've taken away the hammer. The judges can't force people to go to these specialized courts. They no longer have the incentive. And so what's happening to these people though? What treatment are they getting? In so what's the alternative that they're getting instead of these specialized courts now as a result of this bad bail reform?
it's there are a lot fewer people in the courts. You know, courts that
Mhm.
used to have hundreds of people in them now have scores.
And it's
Um,
not because they're not out there. It's they're
oh,
either
they're out there.
not being
They're out
charged, they're not prosecuting them. So they're being left. The public is being told you have to put up with more crime. That's really what's happening.
You have to put up with more crime. You have to put up with more overdoses. You have to put up with more dysfunctional people on the street. You have to, walk
Mm.
past a lot more homeless drug addicts. You have to, on the subway and deal with somebody just running up and down the cars. Um, you know, it's it, these bail reform people are willing to accept all of that because they have this warped view of the criminal justice system as being racist,
Mhm. Mhm.
oppressive, and so the fact that a couple more people get mugged or robbed or even murdered, uh, we have to put up with that in order to drag racism out of the system and reform the system.
Well,
It's
I want to kind of carry this thought through. So, what has been the impact of this bad bail reform on the misdemeanor courts? I mean, it sounds like they've paralyzed them.
they are paralyzed, and New York, it wasn't just bail reform; it was
Mhm.
also discovery reform.
Mhm.
Um, so, I mean, the number of cases that are being dismissed in criminal court, misdemeanor cases that are being dismissed, has gone up like crazy. And it's that's not just the only metric of it, because if I'm a prosecutor and I've got 120 misdemeanor cases on me personally that I have to handle, well, now I have to, and I know that I've got to turn over all this discovery material on each and every one of those 150 cases, which can be an enormous amount of work. And we
Mhm.
have body worn cameras in New York City. So every body worn camera of every officer who had anything to do with that case has to be turned over to the defendant.
Which means it has to be reviewed. Certain information has to be redacted.
Gotten, it's got to be redacted, it's got to be turned over, it's got to be, and then they get it and they'll see something in that and they say, well, I want this now too. What about that officer who's like in the far distance? I want his body worn camera. So you have to get that. And, but, I've got 150 of these cases. So I'm going to look at, well, I'm not going to deal with this petty larceny because it's nonviolent. So I'm going to deal with this assault, which maybe it's barely a felony assault, but it was reduced to a misdemeanor. So I'm going to deal with that case, and these other cases are going to fall apart. I mean, in in the county that I worked in Queens County in 2019. We have in New York State, we have speedy trial. You have to bring the case to trial within a certain amount of time. In 2019, in misdemeanor courts, we had 515 dismissals for speedy trial. In 2024, there were over 8,000, and it's because of discovery reform. And the other aspect of it is when defendants are out, there's no reason for them to take a plea if they know they can just, you know, play around with the case until ultimately it'll get dismissed. Usually the DA's office will come down with a very low offer that the defendant would be able to take.
I,
So,
I talked to a DA in in California, and he said essentially the same thing for all misdemeanors in California. They do a simple release, just like in New York now, and with simple release, they can't make them to come to court, and they also have the Speedy Trial Act. So if their case is not resolved within a certain amount of time, it's dismissed. So if someone doesn't go to court and they don't come back, time is on their side. And the Speedy Trial Act requires the case to ultimately dismissed if it's not resolved within a certain time period. And then you add, like you're talking about, they did a 1-2 punch in New York with bail reform and the discovery reform. And the discovery reform seems like they were built around entirely making it more and more difficult to keep a case in the system and to give traps to fall into that requires dismissal.
The New York discovery reform bill was written by the Legal Aid Society, literally written by the Legal Aid Society. And they tried to get it passed for many years. And then in 2018, the state Senate in New York went from being a moderate, there's a combined Republican and Democratic majority with moderate Democrats voting with the Republicans, and they had a power sharing thing. In 2018, all those moderate Democrats were defeated in primaries by radicals, by progressives. And then one of the first things that they passed was discovery reform and bail reform. And it was written by the Legal Aid Society.
We talked about there were rollbacks to the bad bail reform. Has there been any rollbacks to the discovery bill that passed?
They're trying to do that now.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple of different things, but it's not going to be substantive. It's going to be something that's going to give the governor some talking points for when she's up for reelection. And I think that's going to be something that's going to have to be fought later on again.
Sure.
It's something that's harder for people to understand. Bail reform is a little bit easier because either a defendant is in or he's out. With the discovery, it's very easy to say, well, why isn't a defendant entitled to every piece of discovery material, every police report and everything, all of these other things. But people don't understand that 90% of these cases are going to plead out. They're never going to go to trial. We even did a study that a lot of the defense attorneys don't even read the stuff when we send it to them.
Mm-hmm.
I think, we did it one time with 60 or 70% of the emails that we sent to defense attorneys with discovery material were never opened. So it has changed the criminal justice system from a real legitimate engine for justice into a game of gotcha. And, oh, you didn't give me that, so therefore you have to dismiss the case. And that's it. And it's sad. They got away with a lot of, they won the PR war. I mean, there's just no doubt about that. You couldn't get a reporter or a news anchor to talk about the criminal justice system in New York State without putting the word broken in front of it. Mm-hmm. And that was repeated over and over and over again.
Well, let's talk about, we mentioned that we're going to reflect on this 5-year experiment, but there's been a lot of articles written on the 5-year anniversary, and they're so, it's like they're contradictory. You've got law enforcement saying it's not a success. It's jeopardized recidivism. It's increased crime, and it's jeopardized public safety. And then you've got the advocate groups like the Brennan Center and the Data Collaborative for Justice that are saying, they're not saying that it's decreased crime. They're saying it hasn't increased crime. And they're saying that, any increase in crime was not as a result of the bail reform. How is the public going to differentiate between these articles and these contradictions?
That's the hard thing. What happens with these studies is that they spend months and months writing them. They get 20 people or 15 people to analyze the data. They have statisticians. They have all sorts of things. They have very glossy reports that they finally come up with. And they will have headlines to a 50-page report or a 30-page report or a 20-page report, which nobody's going to read the whole report, except me. I read them. But nobody's going to read a 20-page report. They're just going to see the headlines. And the headlines are always going to be invariably they're going to be that bail
Hmm.
reform had no effect on crime, which is insane. It's just
Yeah.
insane. I mean, I looked at the Brennan report, and it said, this is a quote from the report. Um, One of the first papers on the issue of whether bail reform had an impact on crime used a synthetic control model and a limited data set covering crime in New York City through the first quarter of 2020. The authors concluded that there was no statistically significant evidence of an increase in aggregate crime in the first quarter of 2020. Now, I mean, I've got the CompStat report right here, dated 3/15 of 2020. That's the first quarter of
Hmm.
2020. And crime in New York City went up 20%. And in the whole prior year, in
Yeah.
2019, it went down. In 2018, it went down. For 20 years, it went down. And just 2.5 months into bail reform, it went up 20%. And these people are saying there was no increase in crime.
Well, I
Now,
said synthetic. I mean, the terms they use is so important because, I mean, if you look at these advocacy groups, I mean, I went to one of their websites in preparing for today, and you look about the organization, it says we're part tank, part advocacy. So these are pseudoscience studies. These aren't real studies. They're meant to get to a result, and they're cooking the books if they have to get to that result.
they're absolutely cooking the books. They make up, I'm not going to say they make up data, but they interpret it in a way that supports their opinion. I mean, at one point, I read the Collaborative for Justice, the Data Collaborative for
Hmm.
Justice. They had a report on recidivism in New York
Yeah.
City, and they concluded that bail reform actually reduced recidivism in New York. And just logically, that doesn't make any sense. What was it about bail reform that reduced recidivism? And then I looked at it, and what it recidivism among lower level nonviolent defendants went down. But what also went down was the number of arrests in New York City in 2021 and 2022 because of COVID.
Hmm.
So the chances of getting rearrested went down. But even with that, they found that high risk individuals who had a history of violent crime, recidivism went up. That was in their report, but it was kind of, buried. It wasn't the
Hmm.
headline because it
Hmm.
didn't fit the narrative. And, it's just, it's absolutely frustrating.
Yeah.
And the Data Collaborative for Justice, they did a panel one time. They invited me to it.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah, well, they half invited. They invited somebody else, but they couldn't make it. They suggested me, so I went to it, and I spoke and I answered questions, and I had all my data and all this stuff. Uh, and that was 3 years ago, and I never got invited back.
Of course.
And it's and I was the only person there who was opposed to bail reform, and there were four people on the other side against me, and it was I it's as a former prosecutor, it is extremely frustrating to see what they've done to the criminal justice system in New York and New York City in particular.
Well, and what I would add to it is what these advocates are not telling us, because they know it, but the very people they're harming the most are the very racial groups that they say that they are advocating these policies to help. Because when crime goes up, it goes up much quicker and the harm is felt much faster in our minority communities. And so when they say they're helping these people, they're not. They're hurting those groups more than well, they're that more than any other group.
No, I mean that's absolutely right. I mean, I was shocked when I first looked at the numbers on um, minority victims in New York City. I mean, I know it was high,
Hmm.
uh, but 88% of the murder victims in New York City are Black or Hispanic. 95% of the shooting victims are Black or Hispanic.
Hmm.
Now, those two groups comprise about 50% of the population. Rape, 75%. Robbery, 70%. Felony assault, 78%. Felony sex crimes, 71%. Misdemeanor sex crimes, 77%. Every single crime, they are victims at a higher rate than their percentage of the population. And, and yet when you go up there and say that we have to do something about this, we have to stop letting these people go out and victimize um, people in these communities, you're called a racist, and it is it's something designed not to foster intelligent debate, but it's to shut down debate.
Oh,
And
absolutely. Absolutely. That's what it's intended to do, shut down debate. And let's just extend what the arguments you're making or the points you're making. By and large, in the United States, we commit crimes or people commit crimes within their same racial groups.
yeah,
So somehow in this bail reform movement, this bad bail reform debate, we've decided that we're going to favor the the criminal over the victim.
that's there really is no other way to describe it other than that. And I don't know. I don't know what I don't know what the end game of this is. Because in New York City, they're just building 4,500 jail cells,
Hmm.
and they're going to close Rikers, and that will be the limit of all the people who can be held in jail in New York City forever. And I mean, I don't know what is the point. That the next group of 2,000 people who are going to be released are going to go back into these communities.
Hmm.
90% of the people that they murder are going to be black or Hispanic. 95% of the people they shoot are going to be black or Hispanic.
Hmm.
70% of the burglaries. And, it's what is the point? I'm sorry if I'm getting a little frustrated by this, but it's
No,
something
no.
I've been looking at this for 10 years. When they first started in New York City, they were talking about um, setting up have New York City post bail for defendants who couldn't post bail. That's how I first got involved in looking
Hmm.
at all the statistics and things. And the statistics haven't changed over the last 10 years. I mean, it's always been. It's not like all of a sudden 95% of the shooting victims are black or Hispanic. It has been that way since since the New York City Police Department has been keeping the data in 2008.
But we can see from other parts, other urban areas, what the future holds for New York, especially from the standpoint of the values of commercial property buildings. I mean, you look at San Francisco with all these types of actions going on, you've got commercial properties that are selling for 25%, 30%, 40% of what they sold for just 4 years before. And that's where you're seeing mayors start to stand up because they're seeing the impact of these policies on their tax base and on their tax revenue. And so I think you're going to see in New York where the boroughs, the equivalent of the mayors are going to come out and say, this is now impacting our tax revenue. And so we have to do something. And then, in the 60s, when this finally turned around, it was the inner city pastors who stepped up to say, we have to have a change. And they wanted it and they demanded it because of what it was doing to the young black men, the young males in their churches. I, I would argue that we would have had this backlash 2 years ago, but for the ruling on the Supreme Court on the abortion issue, that overcame the backlash. And so now I think, with Trump's election, with crime, the economy, and immigration, we now have had that backlash. And I think the backlash may be bigger and last longer than it would have without, because we've had this suppression, this pushback, this influencing the news with stuff that wasn't the truth, that was preventing the backlash from taking place earlier. And I think as a result, the backlash may take longer to overcome to start going back to the center. But it's gonna be a while because we still have some urban cities just like New York, in the whole state, but in our urban cities where we're advocating these soft on crime policies. And as Trump rights the ship on crime in other parts of the country, the disparity is going to be so great that there's going to be calls to say, what are you doing? What are you doing to make us more safe? And this is going to get to a point where they can't withstand that anymore, I think.
Well, I mean, I hope you're right. I mean, New York City is different.
Hmm.
Uh, and if you look at uh, the bail setting rates outside of New York City, they're higher higher than they are in New York, in the city. In other words, we let more people out
Sure.
than they do upstate. You're more likely to have bail set on you, even on eligible qualifying offenses. You're more likely to have bail set on you upstate or in the suburbs than you are in New York, which is why the rise in crime is lower outside of New
Hmm.
York City, is in New York City. New York City is a one-party town,
Hmm.
and that's one of the major problems because the mayor's race is decided in a Democratic primary and
Yes.
general election. So it's the most active, progressive people who are out there um, electing the mayor of the city of New York. And I I don't know.
Well, you're starting to see some politicians come out. Recently the New York Police Department or New York Police Department commissioner blamed lawmakers for an increase of number of people who were arrested for crimes while they were waiting trial. You've also seen the mayor of Valley Stream call for a rethinking of their bail reform policies from the state. But you're also, I mean, the most interesting thing I've seen is in New York City, you've got DAs training retailers about the bail reform and how to do a workaround so that they can try to hold more shoplifters who would normally be charged with misdemeanors to charge them with felonies to try to address an issue. And I found that very interesting that we've got almost a recognition by the DA's office that it's not working. And so they're trying to get a workaround.
Well, you can call it a workaround. I call it like a fig leaf. I mean, it's just trying to
So,
cover
hmm.
over some of
Hmm.
this stuff because, you get a guy who goes into Macy's, say, and commits a steals a sweater, and he gets arrested. First of all, that case has to survive in order for uh, uh, Macy's gives him a no trespass. You can't come into Macy's anymore for
Hmm.
whatever reason. So it goes to Stearns, or he goes, it's no longer there, but he goes to
Yeah.
another store. Instead of Rite Aid, you go to CVS to do your
Hmm.
shoplifting, and you're gonna have to get a no trespass note in every one of those stores. And you know, I don't know how many of these DA's offices talk tough now are really going to prosecute those as burglaries, which makes it a felony.
Hmm.
It's a residential. It's not a residential burglary, so um, it's a commercial burglary, so it's not bail eligible. So a judge can't set bail. So the defendant is still going to be out all the while that case is pending. If it ever survives the discovery statute, if it ever survives the whole criminal justice system in New York City, um, it's going to get wiped back down to a misdemeanor because they've got so many other robberies and residential burglaries and murders and shootings that they have to deal with. And we can't be bothered with this guy who just went into Macy's and sold a sweater. Uh, and that's the reality of it. And it's sad because the quality of life and all these merchants out there, the bodega owner, the little shop on the corner, that are being eaten alive by people just picking stuff off the shelves and walking out. They can't chase it, or they could chase after them, but what are you going to do when you catch them? Who
Hmm.
knows if he's got a knife? It's when you don't have the city enforcing the laws that are already on the books instead of trying to invent other crimes, you're really not going to solve anything. I mean, why not, if you really want to get tough on people, and why not make the second time you get convicted of shoplifting, it becomes a felony,
Hmm.
period. You don't have to show that this guy was served with a no trespassing notice. You don't have to bring in five people to do this. Or, if you're convicted felon and you get arrested for any crime, a judge can set bail. I mean, why is this so illogical? Or if a judge finds that you're a
Yeah.
danger to the community or a danger of recidivating, a judge can set bail, no matter what crime you're charged with.
Hmm.
I mean, why is this?
Yeah, why not put an element of accountability in setting bail so that if you have a criminal history, we're going to take that into account. And the reason why they don't want that taken into account is because they don't want that. They don't care about the crime rate because they're addressing a political issue and they're doing it to get to a political result.
I absolutely agree with you. I mean, I used to sit back and think, what is the end result of all of this? Is it just to create complete disorder in the city, or not just New York City, but all around the country? Uh, I mean, what is the point? You know, you let people out who have severe criminal records and they get rearrested and they commit more crime and crime goes up. So you got to sit back and say, well, maybe that wasn't the right thing to do. You
Yeah, in
know,
a normal world, when you do something and you say this will work and you have all this pseudoscience that says this will work and you try it out and 5 years later you both come to agreement that it didn't work and so you go, you know what, this didn't work, so we got to try something else. We don't have that here. We
no,
won't don't even have an admission that it did not work. We have them saying it worked, or at the very least, it didn't cause crime to increase. It's other things that have caused crime to increase. And the thing I love, I mean, I don't love, the things I hate about these pseudoscience people, for the last 4 years, they've been saying, well, crime is not really going up. If you see crime is going up, that's a lie. Look at the FBI statistics. And then last October, the FBI statistics changed to show that they are going up, and it was still incomplete. But now you've got the same groups, the pseudoscience groups, the Brennan Center, then a week later issuing a report saying, well, even if it is crime, even if crime is going up, it's not because of bad bail reform.
well, I've kind of made it a rule that I never believe any study that's printed by any organization that has "for justice" in its title because it just it just fits. A Data Collaborative for Justice, the Brennan Center for Justice, they are advocacy groups.
Mm-hmm.
They don't look at things rationally. They don't look at things, logically, and they employ all sorts of statisticians to take the numbers and massage them
Mm-hmm.
to prove what they want them to prove. And it really is sad. I mean, I looked at like in New York City, if crime had stayed the same in 2019 for the last 5 years, instead of going up the way it did,
Mm-hmm.
there would be 570 fewer murders during that period of time. 570 people. 570 people are dead because of the rise in crime over the last 5 years. Now, you can say, well, it's not because of bail reform. Well, then what is it because of?
Yeah.
Should we be sitting down and having a study, not saying how successful bail reform was, but why did crime go up in New York City on the very day that bail reform and all these other criminal justice reforms took effect? Why did it go up so much? I mean, the way I calculated, there were almost 100,000 more crimes in New York City during that period of time than if crime had just stayed the way it was in 2019.
With all the talks and the groups that I've talked to and the debates I've had with these advocacy groups, it seems like to me that the Democrat Party has outsourced their criminal justice policy, and they've outsourced it to these advocacy groups, and they've swallowed the Kool-Aid. And if they're not careful, these advocacy groups, who are never going to concede something's not working, could be the death of the Democrat Party if they're because soft on crime policies have never been sustainable. They always lead to a backlash because they increase crime. And you're seeing that happen now, and you see a fight, and you see these advocacy groups saying, "Oh, it's not because of these policies," when, like you say, it's obviously because of these policies. And if they don't change course, it could be the death of the party. And you saw that they had a huge impact on the national election because they were saying for 2 years that crime was not increasing, it was just a perception issue. And that was completely destroyed a month before the election when the FBI statistics came out. And if you look at it, if you're a politician or you watch politics, that was the moment that they switched to be 100% yelling that Trump is a Hitler, he's a fascist, because they could not talk about crime anymore.
Yeah, I mean, you're right.
Well, I mean, I tell some groups that, historically we've always looked at law enforcement, or we've looked to law enforcement for crime data. And somehow in this debate, these advocacy groups have said you can't rely upon law enforcement for these statistics or these numbers because they're not, they're biased. And so somehow they've convinced the public that the source for crime data historically is no longer a source. And so I tell people that really, if you can't decide who to listen to, one says crime is down, one said crime is up, you have to go back to listen to law enforcement. law enforcement has always been the source for crime data, and they have to be the crime data source again.
I mean, New York City has the best data
Hmm.
on law enforcement and crime of any agency. I mean, they've been working on this since 1993 when Giuliani came in, and they perfected the ComStat data. They can analyze everything. They can tell you trends. They can tell you how many people are repeat offenders who get arrested and how many times they're arrested in a year or while their cases are pending. And the data is remarkable and it's irrefutable. I mean, crime goes down for 27 years in New York City from
Hmm.
1993 to 2019. You pass bail reform on January 1st of 2020, and within 2.5 months, it goes up 20%. 20%. I mean, that's almost like a crisis. Now it's 30% over 2019. It's leveled off a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
That's
come
because
down a little bit and they say it's decreased 10%, but it's really still up 30%.
it's still up 30%. And the reason it is because, the population of New York City right after bail reform went from 7,800 to 5,800. Then during COVID, it went down
Hmm.
to like 3,900.
Hmm.
That's when they started releasing violent people. And once they started releasing more violent people, that's when violent crime started going up. And now the population is about 67, 6,800. So we're back over almost 1,000 more than were there when bail reform took effect. So crime has leveled off because there are 1,000 more people in jail. Even though crime is up 30%, it's leveled off because we were able to put more of these people in because they've been recidivating. They've been committing crimes repeatedly, allowing judges to set bail on them and put them in. And, that's the reality. And, why they can't look at this and say, well, maybe we were wrong. Let's take another look at this. Maybe we can tweak it a little bit more. But they don't. They will come out with things that sound tough
Hmm.
and sound like we're dealing with this issue, but it really has minor effect.
I would say the lesson of this bad bail reform and New York's bail reform for the last 5 years is we know how to fight crime. I mean, look at the Sanchez versus Alabama case where they had to live under a, a temporary or a preliminary injunction for 4 years where they had to release everybody. They couldn't hold anybody. And after about 6 months, crime started going up. Well, after 4 years, it went to the Court of Appeals and it was reversed and they won. And I talked to the sheriff and he said, we were able to re-implement a system of accountability. And we made it clear to people if they didn't do what they said they were going to do, there would be consequences. And after about 6 months, crime started going down. I think the lesson that we've learned from New York and from these other places about in the urban areas for bad bail reform is we know how to fight crime. We know how to get crime to go down, and we are not doing those things. And that's the political consideration, not public safety consideration that's preventing it.
And the bottom line is, if you want crime to go down, get criminals off the street
Hmm.
and make it uh, raise the cost of them committing crime. I once said that if New York City or New York State were say it's legal just for one day for anybody to steal a car and there'd be no consequences, you could steal anybody's car and it's yours. Well, most people wouldn't steal a car, but there are people who would, and the ones who would are doing it because there's no consequence.
Hmm.
And why is that any different in like reality among criminals who are out there who have a history of crime, and you let them out, they're going to commit more crimes. And if there's no punishment, if there's no consequence to it, they're going to continue doing it until there's a consequence. And that's the thing that these people don't want to realize. They don't want to accept. They don't want to admit that.
So the lesson from January 26th or January 20th, when Trump took office on immigration and the border is, you know, we didn't need a new bill, a new law. We could just enforce the laws we had. And very quickly, the border became manageable. It was closed. Isn't the lesson from that is if we know how to fight crime, which we do, we've done it forever in New York, and we go back to the policies we know that work, we can get control over this situation pretty quickly.
Yes.
And I mean that's the shock of Trump. We know if we like Patel said this morning on a press conference, if we let good cops be good cops, then crime will go down and we'll get control of the situation. Now, he didn't say the rest of it. He just said that we need to let good cops be good cops. But the lesson from all of this and from immigration reform or just from immigration policy, if we let good cops be good cops, we can get control of crime very quickly.
Yes. And we did. I mean, New York City, I mean, in 1993, New York City had 2,200 homicides. In 2019, we had under 300. You know, that's a tremendous reduction in homicides. It's like 85% reduction in homicides. I also said before that we've lost the PR war on this.
Yes.
I say we, I mean prosecutors and law enforcement has lost the PR war on this whole bail issue and on criminal justice, and we accepted all the the claims that the criminal justice system was racist and oppressive and part of a power structure that goes after poor people, and it's all BS. I mean, we all knew it, but in the realm of public opinion, we just lost that battle.
We lost the initial battle, but you can see signs. I mean, the fact that, granted, I agree with a large part of what you're saying. Well, I probably agree with everything you're saying about the rollbacks in New York were more icing on the cake than really substantive. But the fact that they've had to do three rollbacks tells you that there's been a reaction from the public, and the politicians felt it. There's this debate going on now about whether it needs to be rolled back even more. You've got the candidates for running for New York City. You've got our good buddy, what's his name, the former governor Cuomo saying, "Oh, we don't need to roll back any more reform," and you've got other people saying we still need to do substantial rollback of criminal justice reform. So even with all these rollbacks, the debate is continuing to this day about what evil have our politicians released on us, or and I just find it so interesting that the author of these bills that for these original reforms, every time there's a talk of rolling it back, goes on a hunger strike. I mean, that's not policy related. That's just theatrics.
But in reality, we're 5 years into this.
Hmm.
100,000 more crimes. We're almost 600 more people dead. In part because of bail reform, but in part also because of all the other reforms that they did. And there really is no sense of crisis in New York. I mean, New York is a Democratic state. Our state assembly is 2/3 Democrat. The state Senate is 2/3 Democrat. The Republican Party, lost the last election, gubernatorial election, by 6 points.
Hmm.
It's extremely difficult, and like I say, a lot of the reforms that they're coming up with are just tinkling around the edges.
But as we're looking at 5 years reflecting back on New York bail reform with all the things we've talked about today, you would say it's contrary to what we see on the news. It's been an abject failure. There's been substantially more crime. We've had more people killed than would have been killed. We've lost the benefits to turn people around from the criminal justice system because we've taken away the hammer. And so if you take a step back and look at the bad bail reform in New York, you would have to say, if you're being honest, it's been a complete failure and no one's talking about alternatives. And so going forward, the question is, how much longer can the current system withstand the strain of all of the misrepresentations that it's been successful? Because if you look about the rest of the what's been going on in politics, that's really what we've been having on immigration. We can't do anything without a new bill. That all fell apart. You can see on these other things, they're saying, oh, I mean, I never even saw or heard anything about cartels. I even posted a story about one before the election, and it was immediately deleted off social media. I thought it was a mistake, so I posted again. It was immediately deleted, and so and I. And then you heard Trump start talking about cartels. And then after the election, not only was I able to post the story, I was able to do a podcast that wouldn't be suppressed. So it seems like to me that at some point all of this suppression or cover that's being extended to say bad bail reform has been a success in New York can't withstand the truth. And the danger to the politicians is at some point they'll be unmasked and there will be a huge backlash, just like there's going to be on immigration. And the question is, how do they keep that from happening? Because I would say the lesson from the last 5 years is they know that it's not working, but the politics are such they cannot admit it. And so that's where we are in New York, it looks like to me. We're stuck in a failed system until something, until the public forces the politicians to change.
Well, I mean, I don't know what's going to cause the public to force the politicians to change. If they haven't looked at what's going on now and said enough's enough. And I think what's going to happen over the next year or whatever, uh, crime is going to level off, and that's going to be the story. We're at the new normal. Rather than having crime 30% lower, we're going to have it 30% higher, and that's going to be the benchmark. And we're going to measure everything from that point. And it's going to be, see, we told you bail reform was working. Crime is down 2% over last year. Crime is down 10% over last year. Or, this particular crime is down 6%. And we're coming out with these new plans to deal with retail theft, and but nobody looks at the reality of what's going on. I mean, opioid deaths in New York City are going up,
Mm-hmm.
and that's always been my fear, that people aren't going to compare what's happening now to 2019. They're going to compare
Sure.
2025 to
I think
2020.
that's a really good point. But the problem, and what I've said for a long time, is it's not sustainable. What we're currently doing in New York is not sustainable. Do you disagree? Do you think it is sustainable? So the politicians are willing to live with what they're getting right now and call that success and just continue that way as long as possible?
Absolutely. And they're going
Wow.
to, you just have to look at the reports that are coming out. I mean, the Brennan Center for Justice, Data Collaborative for Justice, the controller is going to come out with a report probably saying that, crime is down, and who, all these people are saying bail reform was terrible, but crime is down, and all these other things. It's a new narrative that they're coming out with. They are so invested in in disproving that they were wrong about bail reform, that they are willing to lie about it. And they've been lying about it since 2019, since it
Hmm.
was passed. And what's going to make them stop now? And unless there's a massive change in New York, I mean, in 2021, the Democratic Party lost two DA's offices. They lost Nassau
Sure.
and Suffolk County. These are big suburban counties. One is 2 million people, one is a million people. They lost Democratic DAs because of bail reform, and they did nothing except these little tweaks. Again, that sound tough, but really don't deal with the crux of the matter. And the governor almost lost. It was the closest gubernatorial race. It was still 6 points, but it was closer than normal. And they don't seem really all that eager to do anything. And the city council in New York City is even worse than the state legislature.
Wow. Well, I mean, crap. I mean, uh, uh, pardon my French, but what's the story of hope for New York then?
I don't know. I mean, I, I, I mean, New York was at the nadir in 1993, 1992. Crime was at its height, um, and Giuliani got elected, and everything changed in New York City. Everything, and for 8 years, New York City was on a roll, and then Bloomberg came in for 12 years. Things were on a roll,
Hmm.
and you know, I'm hoping somebody comes in and is able to correct things. It's going to take a long time, um, but it statewide, it's one thing to get something passed um, in New York. Um, it's another thing to get it reversed. You
Mm.
know, like I said, the Democratic 2/3 of our legislature is Democrat, and a lot of those Democrats are progressive Democrats, and they don't want to compromise on any of this stuff. And they are getting in leadership positions now, and they're not going to allow these things to come up for a vote. And if they do come up for a vote, it's very likely that they're going to lose.
Look, you're the one that knows New York. I mean, we're going to have some type of charismatic person come up and do to the Democrats what these past governors have done. Put it in the budget and say it's got to be this, or we won't agree to a budget. But what you're saying has me concerned because even if it passed that way, then you would still have people throwing up roadblocks all over the place. Um, One of the lessons from the last few years over these soft on crime DAs being elected is, they have a huge impact on criminal justice in your county. I mean, that was really, smart of the advocates to go at it that way, but they have such a concerted effort that is built entirely on dishonesty because they recruit soft on crime people, they get them elected, they throw a bunch of money at them, then they invite them to seminars saying, "Here's what you're going to do going forward, quid pro quo," and it's don't seek uh, enhancements on crimes, and you're not going to seek long sentences and a whole long list. And then we're going to have these pseudoscience groups issue research things saying that your new policies will not increase crime. And then you're going to have PR people that are going to tell you how to sell it to your public. It's hard. It's difficult to overcome that kind of machine. But you see the law and order people starting to build a network to do just that. I mean, in the last election, Gascon was defeated by 20 points, and I think there's only one of those Soros DAs left in the whole state of California right now. But we need more of that in other urban areas, and we need it in New York. And, the information that you've given us has been so important. And so, I like to say that the information that we're providing is not coming from anywhere else. And I think that the picture you're painting of New York is bleak, but also tells us what work needs to be done going forward. And I want to thank you. I mean, I'm kind of mad at you for telling me this. I want you to say, "Ken, it's got great. We turned the corner." But the information you're providing to us is so important because we have other legislatures that are being told New York is the model. It's the way everybody should move to. Harris County is the way everybody should be heat treating misdemeanors. And if we didn't have this type of information showing them the truth, we would have other people falling down this road, and then they would be stuck on: do we admit that we were tricked, or how do we? I mean, we can't admit that we were lied to, and all these bad consequences. So they're kind of in this pickle of they have to defend these bad policies, and we've got to educate lawmakers and the public to try to prevent that going forward.
Well, if anybody tells you that New York should be the model, have them call me. I'll talk to them about it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for talking
All
to
right.
me today, and I appreciate it. And it's good to see you again. I'm glad to see you're doing well.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Bye. Thank you for listening, and come back for the next episode of The Bell Post.